It's been now more than a year since I converted to Orthodox Christianity, and since then I've had lots of friends ask me what made me make the switch. It was a pretty wild experience, going from playing piano with some rock-like worship music at a Protestant church to standing out for hours on end, listening to liturgy where often I could barely understand half of what was being said. For outsiders, the Orthodox Church might seem strange, mystical, austere. Thus, I decided to share a little bit of my conversion experience, focusing on the three core arguments that helped me the most. Its historicity, its focus on practice, and its theology of salvation. Please note that I am not in any means an authority on the subject. I'll only be approaching them from the subjective perspective of how they impacted my own way of thinking. For a very nice introduction to Orthodox Christianity, I really recommend the series of books called The Orthodox Faith, written by Father Anthony Hopko. They are available completely for free online. I'll leave the link in my blog post in the description below. It seems that at some point, every believer is faced with some event that will make them question the tradition and the beliefs that they were raised in. For me personally, this happened when I was about 20 years old, and I was faced with some very difficult personal circumstances that made me question, for the first time seriously, the questions of the meaning of life, death, suffering, sickness, and of the unfairness of life and of people. The first place I looked for answers was my own personal understanding of the Bible. Unfortunately, the more honest I tried to be with myself, the less I could see how these texts from over 2,000 years ago applied to my 21st century problems and life. Asking the pastor was no help at all. In fact, it only left me even more confused. Although it was never explicitly stated, my local church often hinted at the idea that prayer and a firm, blind belief in God would lead to supernatural events happening in my life and lots of material blessings, which led then to the inevitable conclusion that every misfortune I lived was somehow part of God's plan to strengthen me or result of a lack of faith and a lack of prayer. Needless to say, this was entirely antithetical to my experience, which is that sometimes in life, no matter how well you do things, you still will get hit. The explanations for suffering that I got from religions like Buddhism and Hinduism and philosophists that I was reading at the time like Lacan or Carl Jung were much more satisfactory. This led me to try and visit other churches, always Protestant of course, and there I sometimes would find explanations which were richer and more satisfying and more comprehensive of my spiritual and existential questions. What I realized though is that the answers would vary immensely depending on which church I was visiting and on the particular experience, the life experience of the pastor himself and whatever books he read. Speaking of books, you would rarely have anybody suggest that you read anything else than the Bible according to your own interpretation. And you would be very lucky to have C.S. Lewis, never mind Martin Luther or Calvin, which are still Protestant authors. After a short period of practically rejecting my original religion in its entirety, I stumbled upon the YouTube channel of the Orthodox icon carver Jonathan Pajot. I was mostly drawn in for his mythological and symbolic interpretations of different legends and myths and fables, until I found, to my great surprise, that he actually was a Christian. Never before had I heard a Christian writer or speaker speak with such depth of understanding and respect about writings and stories from other religions and cultures. I knew then that it was time for me to get into a new rabbit hole which led me to the first point that convinced me and won me over to Orthodoxy. It's historicity. The history of the Christian Church is deeply anchored and totally inseparable from the story of the lives of its saints. Regardless of your denomination, if you stop for a second to ask yourself, where do your beliefs come from? Where does this Bible that you're holding and reading come from? You discover the amazing stories of wonderful people who defended their faith under the threat and terror of death and torture. Perhaps even more wonderfully, we have the details about the beliefs and practices of these people of the early Christian church, which are not a secret in any way. We still have in our hands the very texts that were used to celebrate the liturgies back then. The liturgy of Saint Basil, which is still used in the Orthodox Church in certain Sundays, goes back to the 4th century, merely 300 years after Pentecost. The homilies of St. John Chrysostom, which are explanations and teachings on parts of the Gospel, also come from the same period. Mind you, this is way before we even had a Bible as the collection of books that we know today. Many Protestants today, including myself at the time, have this deep-seated belief that the original teachings and practices of the early church, of the apostles, were corrupted, lost, and mixed with paganism after the reign of Saint Emperor Constantine. But this poses a huge problem as soon as you ask the question, all right, if the Catholic and Orthodox Church are wrong, then what happened between the Council of Nicaea in 325 up until the Protestant Reformation in 1517? Did God abandon his church for 1200 years? What happened to the gates of Hades shall not prevail? This is one of the main reasons why many Catholic and Orthodox converts begin their journeys with a study of the church history. At the very least, I truly believe that reading just a little bit about the history of the church will make you certainly more appreciative for the things, the blessings that you have today, the Bible, the teachings, and the lives of these martyrs, teachers, and saints who fought for the protection of the faith. A beautiful consequence of this long age of the Orthodox Church is that there are many more saints that you can learn about than you could ever count. And this means that for each saint you have their stories with their own personal life perspectives, their own life experiences, and their own personal path towards Christ. You've got nuns and monks and married people. You've got peasants and emperors, children and elderly. Just a huge variety of people from all walks of life who led the best life they could towards Christ. I am yet to find a struggle in my life that still hasn't been lived and vanquished by some saint. Until now, I haven't really spoken about the differences between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. If we were to consider just their apostolic succession, then both churches could say that they are the original, unchanged Catholic Church. Here, Catholic means simply universal, whole, all-encompassing, which is the original meaning of the word. The thing is that since there are a lot of differences between the two churches, then realistically only one of them can be right. And so there are two main ways that I can think of for explaining the differences between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. The traditional, more proper way would be to analyze all the relevant conflicts between the East and West parts of the primordial church through the ages, their differences in theology and ecclesiology, the differences in our understanding of the role of the Bishop of Rome, for example. And the other way, which is what I'm going to do, is to try and approach the actual experience differences in the spiritual life and practices of the Catholic and Orthodox Church. Besides, there is already a load of content on the internet that you can find about the theological and historical differences, but since I have no authority to speak on those things, and because I rarely hear people talking about the practical differences between the churches in the actual lives of the believers, this is what I'm going to approach in the next part. Do your prayers first. Try it. Experiment it. Then read all you want about it. These were roughly the words of my priest following my first confession. And I think that they perfectly summarize the core difference between the Orthodox and the Catholic spiritual life. Compared to Catholicism, Orthodoxy cares less about asserting dogmas and specifics and more about the actual, tangible, audible, olfactory, visual, even palatable experience of the spiritual life. And I mean this literally. The wine that is served for communion is a special kind of wine that is prepared for serving in communion, which is a sweet wine, and it's warmed with boiling water before the offering of the communion to the partakers, representing thus the sweetness and warmth of the person of Christ. Although there are pews and chairs available for the people who need them, most services will make you stand for most of the time and bow to the ground, as you would realistically do instinctively at the sight of God. After the service is done, the priest blesses you with perfumed oils. The churches are covered from wall to wall in beautiful hand-painted icons and art with intricate little decorative patterns in gold or metals. Psalms and parts of the gospel are sung in ancient melodies which are just enrapturing. Even though you might find yourself in a country where Orthodox Christianity is not very popular and all the other attendants are all from a traditionally Orthodox country and you don't understand anything that's being said, you can still participate in the liturgy beyond mere words. In my personal experience, having tried to live as best as possible both faiths before making a choice and finally converting, I believe that the Orthodox Church has a much more thorough support for the practical living of Christianity. The Catholic Church does determine a small set of obligations, such as weekly attendance of the Mass, fasting on certain days of Lent, and daily prayers with prayers such as the Liturgy of the Hours. The Orthodox Church, however, offers a much more thorough, challenging, and standardized list of practices for the Christian believer, which serve less as obligations and more as ideals to work towards. These include eating a vegan diet for practically half the year, giving alms to the poor, praying daily, and normally the specific practices and habits of the believer would be something to discuss with their confessor. Although the comparison might be simplistic, I think the fitness equivalent of this would be to have a personal trainer all the time with you, checking up on you, seeing what you need, altering your exercise plans, covering everything that you need from flexibility, mobility, resistance training, cardio, and just always giving you the feedback as you work towards these goals, as you evolve, as your life circumstances change. In every single parish I've been, the priest would actively encourage me to go and try different fasting and praying methods depending on the things I was struggling with at the moment. This set of practices belonging to the faith, also known as praxis, offer a form of spirituality that makes good use of matter and physicality instead of outright rejecting them as evil. It recognizes that man is much more than just a thinking mind and calls into participation the whole of the body and the whole of the senses. This acknowledgement of the mind-body connection also helped me realize that there is no real difference and separation between my mundane life and my spiritual life. When I exercise, when I eat well, when I sleep well, I can focus better during my times of prayer. And then, through prayer, my life becomes improved. I start seeing more meaning in the work that I do. When I'm sitting at a table and studying, I start cultivating more patience for dealing with people, more faith and hope when going through difficult times. One of the things, if not the thing, which surprised me and shocked me the most when I converted to Orthodox Christianity is the concept of Theosis. The word Theosis means roughly something like becoming one with God, and it is the core explanation for the meaning of life and being in the Orthodox Church, and the definition of what it means to be truly, fully, wholly human. It's a subject so profound that no amount of books, of essays and writings can ever cover it near to its totality. But a child who doesn't know how to read might be able to fully comprehend through their lives. Since I'm not well placed to speak about it eloquently, I will give you some words from the saints. Saint Athanasius the Great says, "God became man so that man might become God, becoming by grace that which God is by nature." And Saint Peter, on the second general epistle of Peter 1:4, "Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust." It is crucial to understand that this becoming God, with a lowercase g, does not in any mean entail becoming identical or equal to God. It is the idea that through practice, repentance, and spiritual growth, any person may fulfill what it truly means to be the image of God. And in the perfection of their imitation of Christ, they become partakers of Christ's life and partakers of His eternity. A metaphor that helps me personally understand this better is to see how each individual cell of yours, despite being a form of life absurdly different from your own, participates entirely in your body and your life. Some might find this notion similar to the Hindu concept of the return of the Atman, which is something akin to the soul, to the Brahman, which is something like the universal primordial consciousness. But there's a fundamental difference. Theosis does not mean the destruction of the individual self as a consequence of union with the divine. Rather, this letting go of the self is precisely what allows you to fulfill what it truly means to be yourself. In other words, he that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. One analogy that is often used is that of the sword and the fire. If you throw a sword into the fire, it will glow red and hot, and thus take the fundamental attributes of the fire, but it will never, in its essence, be the fire. This has immense consequences in the Orthodox understanding of the afterlife, which, rather than being an infinite succession of moments like we live here on earth, towards an infinite future, but always with lots of pleasures and no pains at all, which, let's be honest, would be terrifyingly boring after a couple of years. The Orthodox understanding of heaven is rather one of participating in God's life, existence, in God's timelessness. Christ Himself is the eternal life. Eternity is thus something nor past nor future, but something entirely transcendent and inconceivable. The notion of theosis also deeply impacts the Orthodox understanding of sin, not as the mere breaking of an arbitrary rule, but as an opposition to that which is the purpose of human life itself. To take once again the fitness parallel, if the end goal is to look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime, to sin would be to do anything that would detract you from this end goal. If we understand theosis to be the ideal state of the human spirit, much like health is the ideal state of the human body, then we can see that sin and the passions behind it are much akin to physical illness. Just as we have today a huge wealth of exercise and nutrition information on the internet, the Orthodox Church offers all the resources you could ever need, despite your personal situation, for the healing and the perfection of your spirit. I tried here to convey the core reasons why I converted to the Orthodox Church through 3 rational arguments, with the intent of sharing some casual thoughts that might spark some curiosity and some desire in you to go and seek more information about these things. In which case, I do really recommend once again the Orthodox Faith series by Father Anthony Hopkell, which is once again available completely for free online. It is important to say though that no amount of reading and researching will ever be equivalent to actually going to participate in an Orthodox liturgy, reading the prayers at home, and to try as best as you can to live the spiritual life.